He had a work day or something.
So it was like looking at it. I'm due for Halloween.
My mother. Yeah, that would be the
How long have you been? 2 weeks?
Yeah, I always
Like,
It is.
and what sort of like circumstance?
Yeah. But that
Yeah,
I always see that. I always end up being like, what mask can I make where I can just wear all black and then I'm good to go.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
A coworker of mine.
It's a Sears tower. We just made like 2 white antennas and stuck them out of your head and just wore all black. You're like, I'm a Sears tower.
That's surprisingly affordable. Amazing. I don't know anyone who can send cosmos. Yeah, that's cool. I have one of their friends.
So, and everyone knows it.
I've never been here.
Built in the 20s.
We're going to start this walk now. This is a walk that has been organized between Stella Brown, who has worked here as an artist, and the group Deep Time Chicago, which is a group exploring the way that climate change and ecological change happens and begins in our own area. So we're actually looking at the transformation of the city, the land, the water over a couple of centuries, culminating in now. And this is a perfect place to do this because we have really geological scale installations here. I'm sure you all know that these are still there because they're so hard to knock down that it was decided they were beautiful. I'd like to say anything more. Yeah.
Okay.
Those are the org. Stella will say a lot of things about the area. Deep Time organizes these walks periodically. You're definitely invited to come on any other one, and we're happy to be here now, and I'm going to hand it over to Stella.
And can we say, just in addition, that all these walks are supported by the Goethe Institute? So that's really, we are really grateful for that.
We're very grateful.
And you can check out the this Deep Times program by looking at deeptimechicago.org.
Or the Facebook page for Deep Time Chicago, because sometimes we get it on the Facebook, an announcement on the Facebook page, but it might not make it to the website, but we try to do both, but check both.
Or on the website of the Goethe Institute, we always keep it up to date.
Yeah, they're better.
They have a staff.
Much better.
Okay, take
They
it
have
away.
a staff.
I'm Stella. I was kind of like asked to do a proposal through the Chicago Park District Public Art Initiative, which manages all the public art just in the parks, to do something here, and other artists have done projects here. So I've got an installation that's been up since June and probably up till June, which is really nice. And it's kind of just that way towards the wall. So I think in a minute we can all walk over there, and maybe I'll say more over there when you guys when we kind of congregate. But just to give you like a little background about this site, it was, it's all basically man-made land. It's about 90% man-made land. So the edge of the lake, the coastline, was much, much further that way, closer to where Lakeshore Drive is now. And it was owned by a number of steel companies, mainly U.S. Steel, which is still in the area in Gary. And this site, as they were producing slag, which is the byproduct of the steelmaking process, needing more land, they would dump into the lake, and the city kind of gave them a point at which they could build to, which is where the coastline is now. So everything we're standing on is basically just slag and landfill and rubble. And these ore walls were built to hold all of the raw materials that go into the steelmaking process, so the iron ore and the limestone and other additives. But when we get over there, if you haven't taken a look, you'll see like how massive, like mountain-sized amounts of material could fit in there. And the iron ore would come mostly from northern Minnesota, and it would come down through Lake Superior in boats, and then as we get over there, you'll see there's a slip, a man-made kind of waterway there where the boats would unload into these ore walls. And then this area here where there's all these kind of cottonwoods and prairie kind of stuff, mostly weeds, that's where the big, I think there were 3 or 4 giant blast furnaces were there. And then this southern site, kind of portion of the site, and then there's the northern portion of the site was all given over to producing steel. And so my project was, I'm interested in the kind of geological nature of the site, but because it is an anthropogenic site, I wanted to include the people and the human history that had gone into this site in addition to the geologic history. So I tried to do as much research as I could in the area and talk to people who had worked here or knew people that had worked here or who had lived here. You'll see at the installation there's a little text that accompanies it, which is available in a little box for you to take, and I have more if you don't see them in there. And so maybe let's go take a look and then we can talk and yeah. And just to say, so this park is now, so all the coastal portion of this whole site, which is still owned by U.S. Steel, except for the coast, which was given to the Chicago Park District because through laws that are kind of established by the Burnham Plan, any lakefront property should be like free and open to the public. I think there's an organization called the Last 4 Miles, which is there's only 4 miles of the Chicago lakefront that's still privately owned, and the rest is public. So they kind of had to give this over to the park district, which is why we have this park here. And on the northern portion of the site, they're kind of starting to put in clean caps over the slag, hoping to kind of like work it up as a park. But it's much more raw, and there's all this kind of crazy slag still on the surface that you don't see here. So after this part of the walk, anyone who feels adventurous, we can drive over near Rainbow Beach. There's parking along Lakeshore Drive, and we can walk in. It's a 1.5 miles in to this little slip on this side, so you can look back over at this side. So it'll be a 3-mile round walk. It's all flat, but anyone who feels adventurous, we can do that. And I guess let's walk over to the installation.
Can you say something about where the soil for this park came from?
Yes, the soil for this park came from something called the Mud to Parks program. And this specific park was mud from the bottom of Lake Peoria, which was kind of building up silt and kind of getting all clogged up. So they dredged the lake, threw it into barges, brought it up the Calumet River, and then dumped it here. And the site has been like remediated up to the standards of the Illinois Department, Environmental Department to build on. And U.S. Steel is trying to sell the rest of the site for some crazy development that keeps falling through that the people in the neighborhood are not particularly interested in either, I think, or there's mixed opinions. And so it would be fine to build there, and for this they put a clean cap on it of that mud. And I also happen to know so there's kind of like a prairie restoration thing going on here, which is a little bit an experiment about growing native plants on top of slag and seeing like how they might work to remediate it. And there's another program they're trying to get through the, I guess, like waste management of the city, where they've got all this human waste sewage that they're hoping to put to use, partly because they're sending barges up the river with nothing in it. So some of these kind of bunches of prairie that look more moundy are like built on top of human feces, which is another experiment. I don't think they're advertising
And that's
that, but
coming from where?
that's wherever down the Calumet River there's some like city of Chicago sewer
Yes,
storage.
there's a project right where the
I don't know
it's
exactly.
Stickney. Yeah, there's a second Stickney down on the Calumet River, and there's the area where there's the actually big marsh park and the bike park there, and the highest hill of Chicago, which is a garbage mound.
Yeah.
Right near there, they had an experimental project to make this, to bioremediate with Cook County biosolids.
Yeah, biosolids.
Works
That's amazing.
everywhere else in the world.
Yeah.
I don't know why it shouldn't work here. So they dump some here
Yeah, kind of in little clumps where they're growing the native
just to feed the
stuff.
prairie.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's not everything isn't what meets the eye.
Yeah.
The Mud to Parks program is worth knowing.
And then just other like interesting things. I don't know if we want to walk through the park
That's
together, but there's some pieces from the, I believe it's the Acme steel. Is it
Yeah,
Acme?
yeah.
Like bells from the furnaces are over there. They've been taken from the steel industry, and then this is by a local artist Anyway, let's walk.
I invited him to come.
You do?
Yeah.
Mine has no eyes. I kept meaning
You see, oh no, they're way up. No, are there eyes?
The goggles. He's wearing his work uniform. Hi, so is this your first time here?
No.
No.
To this site? Yeah, it's my second. Yeah.
questions about the site or the installation, we could just talk about it. But basically, everything here was collected on the site or close by along the lakefront. And my purpose was to I kind of was the most excited about the fact that we're just standing on top of slag and that it's this unbelievable massive amount of man-made material that really just looks very much like a volcanic rock. And so you have this really impressive stuff above ground, but you also have this crazy amount of material below ground. And I just wanted to kind of unearth that and make it kind of reveal it and make it interesting to people with similar interests. And the park district really wanted me to use these display windows because they're great and they're just there. And I believe what it was it held gears of some sort that worked the kind of train pulley system, and that's how they would move materials from bin to bin. And then the book, the kind of text that accompanies it kind of reveals all the research that I did about it, because it's just so rich in this sort of new geologic history, but also is connected to, the lakefront is here because of the glaciers. And then it's connected to this whole area, which was new to me, the southeast side of Chicago, which is a really interesting neighborhood because most of the communities that are here formed because of people coming here to work in the industry. And this was just one steel mill or plant, and they're still all along the lakefront, and actually right across the water there you can see, I believe it's Gary Southworks, or Gary Works, sorry, we're on Southworks.
Is Mattel,
ArcelorMittal.
Mattel down there?
It is, I think they're close. Yeah,
Right.
I think they're close.
I think what you're seeing is ArcelorMittal.
Oh, okay.
And then the Southworks would be farther.
Further, okay.
beyond that.
Yeah, so that's still here, and it's an incredibly, in terms of immigrant populations in Chicago, was really diverse. It was the first Mexican immigrant community. It was a Jewish community. It's kind of this whole mix of people that were all brought here because of the industry, and they're a part of this history too. So in the book, you'll see I did a lot of talking to people from the neighborhood and interviews, and I just wanted to kind of reveal that to everyone. And if you're interested, the Southeast Chicago Historical Museum was the first place I went, and that is in the Calumet Park, which is the next public park just down south a little, which has a nice big old field house. And they're in there and they're open maybe just on Thursdays, but it's great. And just when I was there, people from the neighborhood were kind of wandering in and donating more materials. So it's very cool if you're interested in the area. But yeah, if anyone has questions or yeah.
Okay, this bin says iron rich slag, and this one says iron slag, and these are heavier.
Yeah.
So what is there a difference?
So, part of this is sort of me trying to come up with names for this new geology. And I mean, slag is a thing, but I wanted to sort of differentiate between this is lake age slag because it was found on the lakefront and it's been tossed and like turned into this natural shape. That is more just raw slag that I found on the site, and then I differentiated between iron rich and plain old slag just because it seems to have more iron content in it just from the heaviness. Because
the slag with it's not iron rich, well, some of it is.
Yeah.
But, has that iron leached out, or is it a different part of the
it's just a different part.
process?
When they make steel,
Yeah.
you combine in a blast furnace coke, the iron ore, which mostly I believe what they use here is those little pellets, which is
Yeah.
like iron ore turned into little clay pellets. And then you put in limestone, which I have some here, as a flux. And so when you heat it and it becomes molten, the metal separates and sinks to the bottom, and they siphon it off. And then what's left is molten rock, and that flux, the limestone, soaks up all the impurities, all the other minerals, and you have this liquid mass, which is slag. And you can see photos online of like they put it into these train cars lined with fire bricks, take them along somewhere, and just like dump it in this crazy like lava flow looking thing. But slag can be changed based on how it's allowed to cool. It's also super, I talked to geologists about like, well, can you tell me what's like the mineral makeup of it? And they're like, we can't even. It's so mixed together and kind of messy and nasty that they don't even really know. And so it can take a lot of different forms. Yeah.
When they're pouring, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
When they're pouring it, is it like molten? Or?
It's
Yes.
molten. It's like red hot liquid.
Oh,
Yeah.
cool.
And now, so I visited the Gary Works down south. There's a company called Beamsterboer Slag Corporation, and they've been around since like the 20s, and they recycle slag because it's now used, like you'll see, if you go to almost any construction site now, like you'll see slag. If you're digging, you probably dig it up in your garden because it's used as an aggregate in a lot of construction, and it's used on like railroad beds because it's this like insane resource that now they have some more control of. So what they do is they sort of like cool it in a controlled way. They rinse it with water. It takes out all the nasty stuff that would leach, and then they have the guy that I spoke to said when he's doing demonstrations about slag, he'll put it in a glass of water and drink from it to demonstrate how clean their slag is. So it sounds like it can be very nasty, but this type of slag is really not that bad. You know, you probably want to wash your hands if you're picking it up before you eat, but otherwise it's pretty stable, I think. Yeah.
So, Stella, do you know something how the plants grow on the slag? You mentioned that.
I know a little bit, and there's an interview with a ecologist named Lauren Umek in the book, and she's working at a site called, I believe mostly, is it Big Ridge Marsh, which is in another...
Indian Ridge Marsh.
Indian Ridge Marsh, that's it. And that's a really interesting site to visit too, because it's kind of, it's also like a slag field that they're now remediating, but it's next to that big garbage dump hill you were talking about, and there's all these other kind of like factories and industry around it. But she's experimenting with planting native plants right into slag to see how it works. And there is, I mean, I think it's just starting, at least from what she told me. They're starting to figure out which plants can like break it up and turn it back into soil. And like, you'll notice basically like what's down these ravines and what's like on the western side of the park land, that's just what grew here naturally. So you see a lot of cottonwoods, and cottonwoods like calcium and lime. So anything with a lot of limestone, they'll like eat it up and kind of remediate it. So certain plants, yeah, like it more than others.
And is that on top of the clean cap on top of the slag, or is this just straight up slag?
I believe the clean cap kind of ends right about here, and then back there it's just slag. Like if you, anyone who's interested to go to the other site, you'll see without a clean cap, it looks more like this. It's kind of like, it's kind of dirt, it's mostly slag, but some plants are like happy to grow in it. Yeah.
Rudarial ecosystems. Those are the ecosystems that take hold in disturbed areas, rocky, you know, like places that we've trashed. Yeah. And Anna Singh writes about them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question that Tom could probably answer. This stuff and its predecessors.
Its predecessor?
Yeah, what was, because these pellets are, ore didn't always come in the form of pellets, I don't think, did it?
No, I don't think so. I think it was pelletized when it arrived here.
I
And-
actually know the answer.
Oh, there you go. Go ahead.
So it's coming mostly from northern Minnesota, and there's
Minnesota.
this kind of like iron range of mountains that has a ton of iron. So what they do there, they process it up there. They pulverize the rock, then through a process either using magnets or cornstarch, which is interesting, they separate it, and then they have a much more like iron heavy material that's just powder. Then they mix it with bentonite clay and form it into these little pellets. And that's how they ship it down this way because it's easier to ship, I guess. Yeah.
That's right, but they've been doing that since I think the 60s. Is that right?
That I don't know. I don't know.
So that's when they kind of upped the mines in the Iron Range. Before that, they didn't make pellets out of it, but I don't know what it looked like. You know, when
Can you
Yeah.
say Edmund Fitzgerald? Can you say the Edmund Fitzgerald?
30s, you know? I mean,
That's
it
what
was
it was.
already oversupplied.
That was an ore boat, right?
In the early
Yeah.
50s.
Oh, yeah.
Figure this has been going on for a long time. So before these pellets came, there was a different form that came.
Yeah. And I tried to find that on the site or ask people who had worked here, and no one really seemed to know. I mean, I think it just looks like heavy rocks.
Joanne mentions about the most famous ore boat was the Edmund Fitzgerald, of course.
Yeah.
That sunk out there in Lake Michigan.
Yeah, I just
That's what
learned
I
this
was
recently,
hearing.
but I think a lot of people
Or
know about
Superior?
the Edmund Fitzgerald. But someone told me recently is the way that it sank was, it's full of these little pellets, and it's in a really like stormy sea, and it's rocking back and forth, and the friction melted the pellets. And then it was on one tilt, and then they hardened, they cooled there, and then the boat had the load kind of wrong, and it flipped over, and that's how it sunk. That's what someone told me, and they seemed to know what they were talking about.
Melted the iron.
That's what I heard.
Did they fill these whole things up?
Yeah,
They
in the
filled it all the way
book,
back?
there's a photo from earlier in the 20th century where you see it kind of an aerial view of it filled. I mean, I can't even imagine it filled. Apparently they were. Yeah.
Mhm.
Talk about in terms of the project, like were you just walking and picking up whatever you found, or was there sort of a conceptual map that you had that guided what you collected and what you didn't collect?
Well, I started kind of exploring the site and doing some trespassing on the U.S. Steel land and trying to determine if I am not a trained geologist, but if I was a geologist to the best of my abilities, like what are the different materials that I can find here, and kind of tried to categorize them. And from that, I knew I wanted to use these as display windows for kind of like the big, beautiful specimens. But I also wanted to make it more accessible because it seems silly to make it so untouchable and precious. Like that's part of it, but I also wanted it to be accessible since it's already on the ground. But I think you could easily come here and walk over all of this and not really like focus on these things. So I wanted to make people see what my interest in it. But because it's a public park and because this area, has a certain population, there's not like a ton of contemporary art. There's a really good actually art education center called Sky Arts over here. I didn't want to alienate anyone by making it too kind of pristine and arty. So that was the idea behind having the bins open. And then also I'm sure some people have been to, like, if you go to a store and off of Route 66 where they sell rocks, they're in these kind of like bins open to like pick up and touch. So I think it makes them like precious in one way by displaying them like that, but also precious in this way because it's like, at least it's like a commodity worth organizing. Yeah.
People take them, or they want
Well, I think it's bad kids, but people like to do target practice with those. So I just refilled these bins because they just come and like throw them up there. But I hope that some people take them because they're interested. Yeah.
Do you have a stash somewhere, or did you just
Everywhere.
collect them from there? Okay, it's here. It's
In my
here,
car,
it's there.
in my studio, in my
Oh.
basement. No, but actually a lot of it was just collected on site, and then we can walk down to the edge of the shore. Actually, maybe that would be a fun thing to do, to see. It's like the whole coastline is kind of clad, armored giant pieces of slag, which is I collected a lot along the lakefront. Yeah.
Cool.